Previously, we talked about this idea that there's a kind of skepticism regarding whether food should count as art. Now, what we're going to do is turn more specifically to Plakia's positive claim that food can count as art. Now, Plakius begins by considering different accounts of what art is, different definitions of art, or how to understand what aesthetics is more generally. I'm not going to go into all of those details because I asked you to watch a couple different videos where these different interpretations of what aesthetics actually is were discussed. But I do want to mention that Plakius seems to assume that some version of a functional account of art is correct. So it's this functional definition or understanding of what art is that she adopts and focuses on when she's building a positive case for why food will count as art. And so, what does that mean? What is a kind of a functional account of art? On this view of art, at its very core, art is to be understood in terms of the intentions that the artist puts forward in making the art. And so for Placius, she thinks that fits perfectly for her account, because on this view, this functional understanding of art, food could, at least in principle, count as art if it serves an artistic function. For example, if it's intended to provoke different kinds of reflection or convey different forms of meaning or generate different aesthetic experiences in general. Of course, this raises an important question because some may think that this definition is just too permissive insofar as it allows too many things to count as art. Or, on the other hand, somebody might argue that it's too narrow of a definition because it could exclude things from counting as art that we typically do count as art. So let's look at the claim that it's too permissive. Right. So here's my iPhone, and I'm looking at it, and it seems like it's a tool rather than a piece of artwork. But you might disagree. You might think, well, actually, something like an iPhone should count as art. The objection that says it's too permissive, that the functional definition is too permissive, is basically getting at the idea that there are some things in the world that just are not art. And if you think that no, some of those things can legitimately count as art, like an iPhone, then you would probably disagree with this too permissive objection. But why might someone think that an iPhone is art? Well, I think it's helpful to recognize that there have been exhibitions that have been specifically focused on design. In fact, that includes the Met in New York City that actually used the iPhone itself as an object that's worthy of artistic attention. So the idea here is that something like design is included in the intentionality and the presentation can all be a part of the artistic experience itself. On the other hand, there's other sorts of examples that challenge a purely functional account of art, right? Take, for example, something like Duchamp's urinal. If you're not familiar with this particular piece of artwork, there was an artist who his name was Duchamp, and he took a urinal like from a men's restroom and hung it in an art gallery. And this is a very well known, very famous piece of art. Not because it's beautiful to look at, it's not pleasing to the eyes in that regard, but you might think that this is right in line with the objection. Because if we can simply call something a piece of artwork just merely by hanging it on a wall in a gallery, then maybe we're just stretching the definition too far, right? Maybe we're allowing too many things to count as art. But one way to respond to this example involving Duchamp's urinal is to focus on the intentions behind the object rather than the object itself. This is the way that Placius describes this point. Regarding Duchamp's urinal, she says, it was a comment on the definition of art rather than a work of art itself. So to place an everyday object into the context usually associated with art is to comment on art, not to create it. In other words, you can think of Duchamp's urinal as not merely being some object of art that was hung on a wall. The purpose was not to make us think of it as art itself. Rather, the artistic function in the urinal lay in the commentary, not in the creation of some sensory object that's supposed to be appreciated for its form. So according to this functional perspective, you might think that it's really quite interesting because it opens the door for food to be considered as art, depending upon how it's presented and how it's designed or how it's intended. For example, a carefully prepared dish in a fine dining restaurant or a food installation in a gallery, it could potentially count as art if it's structured is to provoke reflection or to convey some sort of meaning or to generate aesthetic engagement, not merely to satisfy hunger. But Placius recognizes that there's other objections to this functional view of art that would allow for food to count as a form of art. One other objection is this idea that food is extremely sensitive to context. Right? Critics will argue that our judgments about food are highly influenced by the context in which we are experiencing the food. And this is something that you may have experienced yourself. Imagine some dish that you've had and some dish that was incredible in one environment. And then you taste the same thing in a different environment, in a different context, and it just seems mediocre. Or think about a restaurant like the Rainforest Cafe. This was a really popular restaurant when I was growing up in the 1990s in Kansas City. I'm not sure if this restaurant was anywhere beyond Kansas City, but you can imagine the kinds of restaurants that this represents. So the Rainforest Cafe was an establishment that was known for its ambiance. It was known for its the environment. It was not well known for the food that was served, right? In fact, a lot of reports were that the food was not very good at all. But it was very expensive because it was sort of a popular place to go because you had this is kind of elaborate rainforest that you were eating in. So, an establishment, a restaurant like this, could be very popular and quite expensive, but not necessarily because of the quality or aesthetic appeal of the food, but because of the overall ambiance or the themed decor, the social experience, or even the feeling of being a part of some sort of spectacle. Right? It's the objection that the food is so dependent upon context. Perhaps it can't even be art in the same way that a painting or a sculpture could be. However, we can respond to that type of objection by noticing that context matters in all different forms of art, right? I mean, just think about the different sorts of museums that spend enormous amount of money and effort designing different exhibits to create an experience beyond the artwork itself. For instance, the lighting, the layout, or the very feeling you get when walking through the building, these are aspects that are carefully thought out and carefully curated in order to give the museum goer a very specific kind of experience. And you might think that the artwork is just different in a different environment. Another example that I think is really helpful here is the example of a Mark Rothko museum, which is actually it's known as the Mark Rothko Chapel in Houston, Texas. So originally, this was a chapel that was created to house Rothko's paintings, which were kind of very dark and sort of very mysterious, and kind of helped people reflect upon death and those sorts of issues, those sorts of experiences. And originally, this was a very, very dark place. And that's because there was no artificial lighting. The only light that came into the chapel was through a skylight at the top. And then over a period of time, the museum went through some renovations, largely due to different hurricanes that had taken place. And a part of the renovations that took place there were to replace the skylight, which actually let in more light. And that affected the way the Rothko paintings looked. It affected the experience that people would have when they went in there. Now, all of a sudden, the lighting was better, right? So the paintings took on a new feel. You could see new colors that you couldn't see before. There was new ways of experiencing the paintings. And this is all because of the context, the environment in which you were observing them. Or if we think about attending a symphony, an important part of the aesthetic experience actually comes from the architecture, the acoustics, and the people that are involved in the experience, the sense of a shared attention and observation, right? So, in other words, it seems like the context is always playing some important factor in an aesthetic experience. So this objection that claims that food should not count as kind of art because it's too dependent upon and too sensitive to the context and the environment, right? Objecting on those sort of grounds alone really actually seems like a form of special pleading, right? We're singling out food for scrutiny while ignoring very similar influences in all forms of art. Now, a second objection that Placius considers is the idea that food is impermanent. right? On this objection, food is inherently to be eaten and then destroyed, right? That's just one of the things that happens. And that's unlike paintings or sculpture or some sort of a musical score, right? Food does not endure over time, it's impermanent. And that seems true. But it doesn't seem like the impermanence of food is a fatal problem for art. And that's because contemporary art provides us many different sorts of examples where the work of art is not meant to last forever, where the meaning or the value is not dependent upon some lasting physical existence or physical structure. Right? There's all sorts of examples like this. Like, for example, performance art, which often takes only for the duration of the performance, right? There's examples where we experience it in a moment and then it ceases to exist physically afterwards. Or there's cases of installation art where we have a temporary design that's created to provoke a very specific kind of experience at a particular time and in a particular place. We have examples of people wrapping different kinds of fabric over different landscapes in an intentional way that's supposed to be temporary. So I think the lesson here is that permanence is not a necessary condition for art. So, in the same way that a kind of installation art or some performance art can be taken seriously as a form of art, food can also be understood as a legitimate artistic medium, not despite its impermanence, but potentially because of its impermanence, right? It's the fleeting nature of a dish that you're experiencing that makes it a kind of aesthetic experience. Highlighting the intensity and uniqueness of that particular moment, that actually contributes to it being art rather than taken away from it. So when we consider these different objections in conjunction together, it looks like we're actually helping the case for Placius, right? Context sensitivity and impermanence, these do not decisively rule out food as being art. Rather, they help us refine our understanding of what actually counts as an aesthetic experience in the first place. And it shows that food can share many of the features that other forms of recognized art have. And having gone through these objections, I think we can begin to see Plagueis's positive case for why food is to count as a form of art and as a kind of object of aesthetic appreciation. But then she immediately emphasizes an important caveat. It's not that all food will always count as art, right? So she wants us to think about the question, when we ask if food is art, which food are we actually talking about? And this is not an insignificant question. This is not trivial because the artistic status of food depends on factors such as one's intentions, one's skills, the presentation, the context. All of these different things, I think, do play a role in how we're understanding food as art. Just as it's the case for other kinds of art. Some creations are more carefully designed or more meaningful than others. For instance, it may be the case that a simple peanut butter and jelly sandwich is not going to count as a form of art. We can imagine a situation where, a very skillful chef can take something like a peanut butter jelly sandwich and under the right circumstances, the right conditions, they could, carefully construct it into a dish of high end that you would find in a very well-known established restaurant. So, to better appreciate Plakius's positive case for why food counts as art, she kind of goes through several analogies to help us think about this. On the one hand, we can think about the distinction between an original copy versus the duplicate copy. In the same sense that we can ask the question about a painting or a piece of music, the question about whether a copy of it is just as valuable or meaningful as the original piece of art, we can ask this about food as well. Right? Think about the recipe as being replicated in another kitchen. Would it carry the same artistic significance as the dish prepared by its creator? That's an interesting question that I think we should consider. Or we can think of a recipe like an analogy for a musical score. The score provides the instructions, but the performance or the preparation, the presentation, and the tasting of it, these are going to be the aesthetic experiences that occur. So, two chefs following this very same recipe might be able to produce slightly different experiences, just as two orchestras playing the very same composition could perform and yield different, distinct performances. There's also various legal and cultural considerations that we need to take into consideration. Issues like copyright and intellectual property will complicate our understanding of these issues, right? Who owns the artistic expression in a dish itself? Is it the chef who designs it? Or is it the restaurant that presents it? Or the culture from which it originates, right? These are questions that are analogous to debates in arts with regard to authorship and originality. And that seems to give further credence to this idea that food and our experience or pleasure of food does count as a form of artistic expression or an object of artistic appreciation. And so, by highlighting these different nuances and complexities, I think Blakey is attempting to help us see why food as art is not simply about everyday eating itself. Rather, it's about culinary practices that aim to provoke aesthetic reflection, the kind of delight or engagement, enjoyment that we find, and ways that are comparable to recognized forms of art. Things like taste and smell, presentation, context, these things all contribute to the experience, just as form, color, sound, space, all these other things contribute to visual or musical art forms. So, when we're evaluating food aesthetically, we are looking for the combination of the right sorts of skills, the right kinds of intentions, the right sorts of sensory richness and context that helps allow for the experience to rise above mere sustenance or mere bodily pleasures. This can help clarify why food indeed does count as art, only under certain circumstances and conditions, according to Placius, and only when the creator's intentions and the quality is executed correctly in the context of a genuine kind of aesthetic experience. Now, the way that I want to conclude this module is by offering you some different clips from the TV show The Bear. I think this show is incredible. And I think these sorts of short clips will actually do a nice job of illustrating the idea that maybe in some situations, food can be an object of beauty, an object of aesthetic appreciation or aesthetic experience after all. And I want you to think about these sorts of questions as it relates to your own life and your own experience, your own background with food, right? So when you're going to do the discussion for this week, I want you to be thinking about your own relationship with food and whether or not it actually counts as a form of art. And of course, as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email or ask.